Before the legends, before the lists of wonders, before kings dreamed of touching the heavens, there was only sand, endless, whispering, golden, and in that sand a city began to glow. The night before Babylon was born, the desert lay still, an ocean of stars above, an ocean of dust below. Then, from the silence, came the first small sounds: chisels striking stone, ropes creaking, water sloshing in clay jars. A city was waking inside the dark. They said it was being raised for the gods, for glory, for empire. But the truth was quieter. It was being built for love. On the river's edge, the Euphrates curled like a ribbon of moonlight. Torches flared along its banks, and inside one of the royal tents, a man sat sleepless. The prince who would soon be king, Nebuchadnezzar too. He gazed across the desert toward the west, where his queen, Amytis of Media, missed the cool green mountains of her youth. He saw the longing in her eyes, the loneliness that no crown could cure. And in that silence, he made a promise. He would bring her mountains. He would make rivers climb the sky. He would create a paradise where none should live, a garden suspended in air, fragrant enough to remind her heart of home. So began the dream. Morning spilled across Babylon. Stone by stone, terrace by terrace. Men carved the impossible. Great arches rose from the plain, their shadows falling like stairways of dawn. Massive columns rooted into the sand, as if the earth itself had sprouted trunks of limestone. And at their summit, the builders laid soil so rich it swallowed sound. They planted life there: figs, palms, pomegranates, lilies, myrtle, almond, jasmine. From far off lands the seeds came, wrapped in silk and prayer, and slowly the desert began to green. Above the city, water shimmered. Some said hidden pumps drew it from the river. Others swore it was divine magic. Whatever the truth, the people looked up and saw waterfalls, sliding down through vines that glowed in sunlight. They called it a miracle. They called it the Hanging Gardens. For a while, Babylon believed it would never fade. The queen smiled again. The king felt his heart steady. The air smelled of cedar and honey. And below the terraces, the city thrummed. Merchants calling, camels groaning, children laughing under a rain of petals drifting from above. Centuries later, travelers came and tried to describe it. The Greek historian Strabo wrote of terraces that rose like the seats of a theatre. Philo of Byzantium called it a work of art surpassing all others. They spoke of mechanical marvels that lifted water higher than any man had seen, of roots clasping stone as tenderly as fingers entwined. To them it was proof that Babylon was not merely an empire, but a wonder made flesh. And yet, no one who spoke of the gardens ever truly agreed on what they'd seen. Some said they stood beside the palace. Others swore they floated above the river. Some insisted they were in Nineveh, not Babylon at all. The records blurred like heat over sand. When the empire fell, when conquerors came and left, the terraces sank beneath time. The river shifted its course. The vines turned to dust, and the story slipped from history into myth. But myths, unlike stone, do not crumble. For thousands of years, the Hanging Gardens lived in whispers. In poems, in paintings, in the half-dream of every traveler crossing the desert. They became a mirror for longing itself, the hope that beauty can grow where it has no right to live. Scholars in faraway cities argued over clay tablets, counting words like petals. Did Nebuchadnezzar build them for Amytis? Did they ever exist? If so, where are the ruins? Each theory glimmered for a moment, then vanished into sandstorms of debate. Meanwhile, ordinary people, storytellers, lovers, wanderers, cared less for proof than for meaning. They told the story by firelight, their voices soft with wonder. And in each retelling, the gardens grew a little higher, a little greener, until they brushed the very stars. Time carried the legend west. In Greece, philosophers saw it as the marriage of reason and desire, man engineering paradise. In Persia, poets made it a symbol of devotion. In Rome, it became the image of paradise lost. And everywhere, the idea remained the same, that love could make the desert bloom. Imagine it now. The heat of noon softens into amber dusk. From the highest terrace, the queen looks out across her kingdom. Below her, the city hums like a living drum. Above her, doves wheel through the cooling air. The scent of fig leaves and water lilies drifts upward. She closes her eyes, and for a heartbeat, she is home. Among the mountains of Media, where the air tasted of pine and snow. When she opens them, she smiles at her husband standing beside her. He has kept his promise. The world, for this one evening, is perfect. Then centuries roll by. The torches dim. Empires crumble. Sand covers the stones. But the dream remains, buried yet breathing. Modern explorers come with maps and machines. They fly drones over Iraq's plains, tracing invisible lines. They scan the ground with radar, searching for foundations deep beneath the dust. Some think they've found clues near the city of Hilla. Others argue the true gardens stood far north, in Nineveh, built by another king entirely. Still the question hangs in the air. Did the Hanging Gardens ever really exist? Perhaps they did. Perhaps they were never a place at all, but an idea, a story so loved that it became more real than any wall could be. Because sometimes the human heart builds things the earth cannot hold. Picture a historian sitting alone at a desk late at night. The lamplight pools across ancient maps. Outside, rain taps against the window. She flips another page, searching for evidence, but finds only gaps, missing tablets, broken lines, lost names. Yet in those empty spaces, she feels something stirring, the echo of running water, the whisper of leaves. She closes her eyes, and for a moment she sees it. Terraces rising into mist, a queen laughing among flowers. When she opens her eyes again, the vision is gone. But the warmth remains. That is how legends survive. Even without proof, they linger. Not in ruins or relics, but in imagination. They feed something deeper than curiosity. They feed the need to believe that beauty, once made, can outlive its maker. The Great Pyramid endures in stone. The lighthouse of Alexandria endures in memory. The Hanging Gardens endure in longing. They are the wonder that never leaves the heart. And so the story flows, gentle and endless, like the river that once fed its roots. If you stand tonight beside any body of water, a fountain, a stream, a sea, listen closely. You might hear the same sound the builders heard under the Babylonian moon. Water rising, falling, breathing. Each ripple carries a fragment of the promise Nebuchadnezzar made. Each drop recalls the love that defied the desert. Because though the terraces have vanished, the reason they were built has not. Every act of tenderness, every seed planted in barren soil, every home filled with care, all of it is an echo of that ancient vow to bring the mountains to the one who misses them. Close your eyes. You can almost feel the cool spray of those phantom waterfalls on your skin. Smell the wet earth. Hear the quiet laughter of ghosts among the leaves. Perhaps that is where the gardens truly exist. Not in Babylon, not in Nineveh, but in the shared dream of everyone who has ever wished to make another person's world a little softer. And that dream, unlike empires, does not die. The night deepens over the plains of ancient Mesopotamia. The stars hang low, suspended like lanterns over the sleeping ruins of what was once the center of the world. The river glides by, whispering stories it has told for thousands of years. Somewhere beneath that water, they say, lie the stones of the garden. Cold, patient, waiting. Centuries pass like the turning of pages. Babylon becomes a name, then a symbol, then a ghost. Empires rise where its dust once drifted, but none can capture its shimmer. That strange balance of engineering and emotion, of power born from love. And always, the question remains, did it ever really exist? Historians have searched, each convinced they stand on the edge of revelation. In the 19th century, when explorers first stumbled upon the mounds near Hilla, their hearts beat faster. They thought they had found the walls of Babylon itself. As they brushed sand from the baked bricks, names appeared. Nebuchadnezzar's name, stamped into the clay over and over again. Proud and defiant, I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the restorer of temples, the builder of wonders. And yet, no garden, no terraces, no fountains, no traces of the vast irrigation system described in ancient texts. Only fragments, walls, foundations, shards of color that once caught the sun. The explorers stood in the heat and wondered if the desert had swallowed everything. But as they worked, a strange realization began to dawn. Maybe they were looking in the wrong place. For across the desert, far to the north, another city slept beneath layers of dust. Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. There, long before Nebuchadnezzar's reign, ruled King Sennacherib, a man obsessed with water. He carved canals through mountains, built aqueducts that stretched for miles, and inscribed his victories on stone with the same pride Nebuchadnezzar would one day show. And in those inscriptions, one line caught scholars' eyes. I made a wonder for all peoples. I raised a high garden beside my palace, filled with trees of every land. Could it be that the hanging gardens, the wonder of the world, were not in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, that the Greeks, hearing stories centuries later, had simply confused the two great cities of Mesopotamia. It was an idea both thrilling and heartbreaking. Thrilling, because it solved the mystery. Heartbreaking, because it meant the story of Nebuchadnezzar and Amytis, the tale of love creating paradise, might be no more than a legend born from echoes. Still, the legend persisted. Because sometimes, truth alone cannot satisfy the soul. Think of the historians again, bent over fragments of clay tablets in the flicker of museum light. Their eyes blur, but their minds drift, not toward the dry measurements of stone, but toward the vision behind it all, a world where a king would build mountains for love. And that vision, though unproven, is somehow truer than any inscription. The gardens may have changed names, locations, even centuries, but their essence never faded. They became something more than a structure. They became a metaphor for every impossible act born from devotion. It is late now, the hour when cities quiet and thoughts wander. Let us wander too, deeper into imagination. Picture walking through those gardens. The air is cool, damp with the breath of leaves. Moonlight catches on droplets sliding down ferns. You can hear the soft machinery of hidden pumps. The heartbeat of the garden. Water winds upward through bronze spirals, spills from terrace to terrace, glittering like silver chains. Somewhere a bird sings, half asleep. You reach out and touch the bark of a tree. It's smooth, faintly warm. Beneath your fingers you feel not just life, but intention. The echo of hands that once planted it here, defying reason, gravity, and empire. In the distance, you see the queen walking slowly between the vines. Her gown trails through the dew. She pauses, looks up, and whispers something, a prayer, or maybe a thank you. And though the centuries have long since erased her voice, the sound feels familiar. You know it, because it is the same whisper that lives inside every person who has ever loved and lost and built again. The gardens become a mirror, not of Babylon, not of Assyria, but of us. The dream of creating beauty for another, even when the world says it cannot be done. That is what survived. That is what hung in the air long after the bricks fell. As the night wears on, the story drifts toward its quiet heart. Somewhere, a storyteller in ancient Greece sits by the fire, retelling the wonder. He has never seen Babylon, never crossed the desert, but he can see it in his mind, tier upon tier of green, like a staircase to heaven. The listeners lean closer, their eyes wide, their souls reaching toward that impossible vision. And with each retelling, the garden grows again, in words, in wonder, in the spaces between belief and dream. Millennia pass, and still it grows. In every artist's brushstroke, every architect's sketch, every poet's sigh. Even today, in cities of steel and glass, we chase the same dream. Rooftop gardens, vertical forests, walls that bloom. Every vine climbing a skyscraper is in some small way Babylon reborn. The hanging gardens are not gone. They have only changed form. Because when humanity dreams of beauty, it dreams upward, The winds shift over the plain. Sand drifts over ancient stones. Somewhere, the Euphrates hums its endless song. Perhaps beneath that slow and secret current, the old bricks still rest. Perhaps a seed still sleeps between them, wrapped in clay, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, when the right hands uncover it, when the right rain falls, the garden will rise again. As it always has, not from stone, but from longing. And so the sleepy history of the hanging gardens ends not with a conclusion, but with a continuation. The open loop remains, because how can you end a story that was never fully found? Close your eyes now. The desert is quiet. The city has turned to dust. But somewhere in that silence, water still flows. You can almost hear it. The sigh of the pumps, the trickle of the streams, the rustle of palm leaves whispering to the moon. The scent of jasmine fills the air. Time slows, and for a fleeting heartbeat, you are there, standing on the highest terrace, looking down upon the sleeping world, watching the wind play through vines that have waited centuries for you to remember them. Maybe the gardens never existed in stone, but tonight, they exist in you. And when the dawn comes, and the sun spills over the horizon like molten gold, the story will wake again, somewhere else, in another heart, in another city that dares to dream of green against grey. Because wonder never dies, it only sleeps. Because wonder never dies, it only sleeps. And yet, even in sleep, it dreams. The wind carries dust over forgotten stones, but beneath that dust, memory stirs. It begins softly, a scent of rain in air that hasn't known rain for centuries. A tremor in the ground, a murmur of water that should not exist. Something, someone, remembering. Long ago, before the fall. The queen awoke one night to the sound of the garden breathing. From her balcony, she watched the moonlight spill down terraces like liquid silver. The vines swayed though there was no wind, and the fountains seemed to whisper secrets to one another. For a moment she wondered if the gods had entered her dream. She descended the marble stairs barefoot. The stones were cool beneath her feet. Everywhere she looked, life shimmered. The palms glowing faintly, the fig leaves trembling. It was as if the garden itself were alive, not just with roots and petals, but with thought. At the center of the highest terrace she stopped. There, where water flowed from a hidden channel, she saw her reflection. And beside it, the faint reflection of another woman, younger, crowned in flowers instead of gold. She blinked, and the image was gone. But she felt it. The presence of something ancient watching, approving, remembering. And in that instant, Amytis understood this garden was not only a gift to her, but a bridge between what was and what could be. A place where the earth's longing met the sky's desire. Years passed like petals drifting downstream. The garden flourished. Babylon shone. Nebuchadnezzar's hair turned silver, and Amytis's laughter grew softer. At night, they would walk together among the terraces, hand in hand, speaking of their youth, their wars, their victories, and always of the mountains she once missed. The king would look up at the stars, reflected in the pools and whisper, "I have brought you your mountains, my love. But one day, who will bring them to me?" The queen smiled and said nothing, because she knew all things built by love are also bound by loss. Then came the fall. The air grew heavy with the scent of smoke. Whispers of invasion rippled through the city. The Euphrates darkened with ash. The gardens, still green, still perfect, swayed helplessly as armies approached. Among the gardeners was a young man named Ammon. He had tended the fountains since he was a boy, knew each vine, each root, each whisper of the wind through palm leaves. When the soldiers entered Babylon, he climbed to the highest terrace and tried to protect what he could. He poured water over the roots, hoping they would drink enough to survive whatever came. He spoke to the trees softly, telling them not to fear. But one by one, the pumps stopped. The channels broke. The water fell silent, and with it, so did the song of the garden. Flames rose in the distance, reflected in the pools like cruel suns. Ammon stood there until dawn, watching petals drift down like snow. When the city finally fell silent, he gathered a handful of soil, dark, rich, still warm, and hid it inside a small clay jar. He buried that jar at the edge of the river, whispering, "Sleep now, my friends. The world will forget, but not forever." And so the gardens were swallowed by time. Centuries later, the river shifted course again. Storms came and went. New cities rose above the old, built on their bones. Travelers passed and spoke of a hanging garden, but no one could find it. Only the wind seemed to remember the way it once moved through vines suspended between heaven and earth. Then, one night in the modern world, a sandstorm swept across the plains of Iraq. When morning came, something strange appeared. A patch of ground newly exposed, the outline of terraces faint beneath the dust. Archaeologists came with their instruments, their drones, their quiet awe. They mapped every stone, every curve, every whisper of structure that might once have been part of a legend. Among them was a woman named Dr. Layla Rahman, who had dreamed of the gardens since childhood. Her grandmother had told her the story under oil lamps, her voice soft as wind through reeds. And now, standing on that plain, Lila felt the same hush that must have filled the air thousands of years before. They began to dig. At first, nothing, only clay and broken pottery. Then, a corner of a wall, its bricks glazed faintly green. A fragment of inscription. "For she who missed the mountains." The team froze. Lila touched the brick gently, her hand trembling. That night, she could not sleep. She sat outside the camp, staring at the stars, listening to the wind. And in the stillness, she thought she heard it. Faint but unmistakable, the trickle of water. She followed the sound. It led her down a shallow slope to where the Euphrates shimmered faintly under moonlight. There, half buried in silt, she saw something small, a jar, cracked but intact, sealed with clay hardened by time. Her hands shook as she brushed away the dirt. The jar was light, almost weightless. She lifted it carefully, turned it in her palms. Something inside shifted softly, like dust or seeds. Back in her tent, she opened it. Inside lay a handful of dark soil, and nestled within 3 tiny, dry seeds, smooth, curved, impossibly preserved. She stared at them for a long time, feeling a rush of warmth through her chest. Could it be? After all these centuries? The next morning she planted them in small pots near the camp's edge. The others laughed kindly, told her nothing would grow, not after 2,000 years. But Lila watered them anyway, every morning and evening, as the ancient gardener once had. Days passed. Weeks. Then one morning, as dawn broke pale and rose across the plain, she saw it, a tiny green shoot pushing through the soil. Delicate, trembling, alive. She fell to her knees, tears stinging her eyes. The others gathered around, silent. And for a moment, Babylon breathed again. News spread. Scientists came. DNA tests were done. The seeds, impossibly, matched plant species native to both Mesopotamia and the highlands of Media. The very mountains Queen Amytis had once called home. The world watched in wonder as the plants grew. Soon they stood taller than the archaeologists themselves, vines twisting around poles, flowers opening like forgotten stars. The scent was strange, unfamiliar, sharp and sweet at once, something that did not belong entirely to this age. At night, Lila would sit by them, notebook in her lap, eyes closed. Sometimes she thought she heard whispers among the leaves. A woman's voice, faint as wind. Tell them we lived. Tell them we loved. She began writing. Not reports, not articles, but dreams. She wrote the history of the Hanging Gardens, as no textbook could, as a memory half awake. And in doing so, she wove the story of Babylon back into time. The garden grew in her care, slowly but surely, until it became a living museum. A small replica of what once was, surrounded by the hum of modern life. People came from every corner of the world to see it. Children ran between the vines. Old travelers closed their eyes and inhaled deeply, smiling through tears. And when the wind blew just right, they swore they could hear the faint rush of ancient water lifting skyward again. Lila knew she had not rebuilt the true Hanging Gardens. No one could. But she had done what mattered most. She had awakened the dream. One evening, as the sun sank low and the vines swayed in golden light, she whispered, maybe it was never about proving they existed. Maybe it was about remembering why we wanted them to. Because every civilization builds its own gardens, some in stone, others in the heart. And perhaps the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were both one real, one eternal. As twilight fell, she looked toward the river, imagining how it must have looked centuries ago. Torches flickering, the terraces glowing, the air thick with the perfume of love, made green. The world turned quietly around her, and in that hush, she could almost see it again. The queen on her balcony, the king beside her, their silhouettes framed against the breath of paradise. Then the wind shifted. A few petals, pale, fragrant, impossible, drifted through the air and landed at her feet. Lila smiled, closed her eyes, and whispered into the dusk, sleep again. My Babylon. Until someone else remembers. And somewhere beyond the desert, where time folds in on itself, the river laughed, soft, eternal, alive. Because wonder never dies. It only sleeps. The night after her broadcast went viral, Dr. Laila Hassan couldn't sleep. The museum courtyard lay silent, silvered by the moon. And the small pool she'd filled with ancient reeds glimmered like a mirror of forgotten rivers. She kept thinking of one phrase that people had written beneath the video. Maybe we still need the gardens. By morning, Babylon was swarming with voices again. News crews, drone cameras, scholars, officials, all speaking in dozens of tongues, all convinced they were witnessing history reborn. Layla stood among them, exhausted and dazed, like a ghost watching her own discovery dissolve into spectacle. When the first dignitaries arrived, their motorcades trailed dust through the ruins. A foreign minister declared that the hanging gardens would become a beacon of peace. Another promised millions to restore the heritage of mankind. But as their cameras rolled, Lila felt a strange chill. Everyone wanted the miracle. No one wanted the patience that had built it. She retreated to her lab trailer, where fragments of baked clay still smelled faintly of river mud. A single vine crept through the half-open window, its leaves trembling in the warm wind. Layla touched it, remembering the ancient gardener she had imagined so many times. The man who watered the terraces until his hands cracked, believing each drop held the sky itself. Outside, the noise grew. Reporters shouted questions. A helicopter circled. And in that rising storm of attention, she realized the gardens had returned. But this time not as a place of wonder, but as a prize. Weeks turned into months. The dig transformed into a construction zone, wrapped in scaffolding and banners. International sponsors arrived with blueprints and slogans. Rebuild the wonder. Green future from the cradle of civilization. They cleared pathways, planted imported trees, installed LED fountains that sprayed water in synchronized arcs. The world applauded. Lila watched silently from a distance. The plants they brought thrived too quickly, fed by chemicals and machines. Their leaves gleamed with an artificial perfection she'd never seen in the desert. She felt both pride and grief. Pride that her work had inspired renewal, grief that the mystery had been replaced by convenience. One evening a sandstorm rolled over the site. The air turned copper, lights blinked out. Layla took refuge inside a half-finished pavilion, clutching her field notes. Through the storm she heard workers shouting, metal twisting. When the wind finally calmed, one of the new terraces had collapsed. The irrigation pipes torn apart by the same dry breath that once shaped Babylon's ruins. The next morning the sponsors called an emergency meeting. They blamed the local laborers, the climate, the outdated designs. No one mentioned the simple truth that the land itself had moods, that it accepted wonder only when treated with humility. Layla tried to explain, but her words fell between languages, lost amid legal terms and budgets. That night she returned alone to the excavation pit, where she had first uncovered the ancient foundation stones. Under her flashlight, they looked like sleeping animals, ribs half buried in sand. She knelt and whispered to them, "I woke you again, and now they will cover you once more." "I'm sorry," a faint sound answered. A drip of water from a cracked pipe. It echoed softly in the darkness, like a heartbeat. Months later, global interest began to fade. Other stories stole the headlines. The sponsors withdrew. The scaffolding rusted beneath the sun. Lila stayed. She used her own savings to maintain the smallest section of the site. A single terrace where native reeds had begun to root on their own. She tended it quietly, just as that forgotten gardener might have done, using buckets drawn from the nearby well. Each morning she watered the soil until her arms ached. Each evening she wrote notes no one would read. Then one dawn, as she carried water to the terrace, she saw something that froze her breath. A new shoot had sprouted overnight, not from any planted seed, but from the ancient mud brick itself. Its leaves were broad, veined like hands reaching upward. Tiny drops of dew glimmered along its edges, reflecting the first gold of sunrise. It was as if the earth remembered itself. She spent the next weeks nurturing that single plant. Tourists came and went, ignoring it. But for Lila, that modest green spark was more miraculous than any LED fountain. It whispered that the gardens did not need to be built. They only needed to be listened to. The following year, drought hit the region. Rivers shrank, crops failed, and the government ordered strict water rationing. The reconstruction project was officially suspended. Journalists called it the second fall of Babylon. Yet amid the dust, Lila's small terrace remained alive. Each evening, she redirected the last trickles of her ration toward the roots. Neighbors thought her foolish, wasting water on old myths. But sometimes at night they saw her silhouette moving among the reeds, and something in that quiet ritual softened them. Soon a few children began to help her carry buckets. Then their parents joined. By midsummer, the entire street was bringing leftover water to her garden. It became a ritual every sunset. A line of people climbed the low mound, pouring what little they could spare into the cracked soil. From above, it must have looked like veins of light converging upon a heart, and slowly the heart began to beat again. Within weeks, the vines thickened, wrapping the stones in green. Birds returned, and one morning, after an unexpected rain, the terrace overflowed with blossoms. White, pink, yellow, cascading down like tiny waterfalls. Lila wept. The world might have forgotten, but the land had not. News of the living terrace spread online, first as a curiosity, then as a symbol. Headlines called it the People's Garden. Pilgrims arrived carrying jars of water from their own homes, some from as far as Greece and India, pouring them into the soil as offerings. Each drop mingled with the next, creating a patchwork river of faith. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, an elderly man approached Lila. He introduced himself as Yusuf al-Rahim, the last surviving descendant of a family of gardeners who had tended the museum grounds for generations. From his pocket, he produced a tiny clay seal, worn smooth with age. "I found this when I was a boy," he said. "It bears the mark of Nebuchadnezzar's palace. I think it belongs here." Stars matched the carving she had once seen on the ancient foundation stone. She placed the seal into the soil beside the blooming vine. For a moment, the breeze carried the scent of something older than memory. Yusuf smiled. Now it's home again. Then, he turned and walked into the dusk. That night, Lila dreamt of the old Babylonian gardener. He stood upon a high terrace, water pot in hand, watching the same stars reflected in 1,000 tiny pools. When he looked at her, his eyes were not ancient or young. They were timeless. He said nothing, but she understood. The gardens never died. They waited for you to remember how to care. She awoke to thunder. Rain pounded the roofs. Lightning flashed over the river plains. When dawn came, the city smelled of wet earth, and the terrace had grown beyond belief. The vines now climbing the broken scaffolds, the blossoms glowing like captured sunlight. From that day forward, no one called it a reconstruction. They called it the rebirth. They called it the rebirth, and for a while the name carried the weight of prophecy. Every network wanted a picture of the green terraces, shimmering under dawn light. Every nation claimed kinship with the miracle. Politicians arrived again, but this time they came barefoot, symbolically pouring water from silver cups. The world seemed ready to believe that beauty might heal it. Lila stood among them, smiling faintly. She should have felt triumph, yet what she felt instead was fragility. The sense that everything alive is one draught away from silence. Still, she let the ceremony unfold. Cameras flashed, choirs sang in 12 languages, and on the highest terrace a small child released a dove. It rose spiraling through the humid air, white against the violet sky, and for one trembling instant the crowd forgot itself. That night the city celebrated. Skylines glowed green, fountains projected holograms of ancient palms. On the museum's steps, Layla gave a speech broadcast to millions. She spoke not of glory, but of stewardship. How every civilization was a gardener's hand reaching toward tomorrow. Her voice shook as she ended. Babylon has bloomed again. Let us learn this time to keep it alive. Applause thundered, but deep down she knew applause fades faster than petals. Weeks passed. The world's attention deepened into obsession. Tour companies built viewing platforms. Influencers posed with the vines. Brands offered Garden of Babylon. Perfumes and bottled Holy Dew. Environmental conferences adopted the terrace as their logo. At first, Lila tried to stay focused on research, documenting soil chemistry, root genetics, rainfall data. But her funding now came from agencies more interested in symbol than science. They wanted the garden exported, copied in capitals, franchised, globalized. A memorandum even proposed a sister garden on the roof of a skyscraper in Dubai. Leela hesitated to sign. She dreamed of the old gardener again, standing in silence beneath the stars. In his eyes she saw disappointment, like a father watching his children trade wonder for fame. Then came the storms. Across the region, weather turned unpredictable. Seasonal rains shifted. Winds carried dust thicker than before. Some blamed climate change, others divine warning. Whatever the cause, the rebirth began to struggle. Leaves browned at the edges. The delicate vines wilted under new heat. Water pumps failed as fuel shipments stalled. Lila worked day and night with a small team of volunteers, hauling barrels by hand. Journalists filmed her exhaustion, turning her effort into spectacle again. A foreign network aired a documentary called The Woman Who Would Save Babylon. It won awards, but on the ground, the garden still thirsted. One afternoon, as she stood knee deep in the cracked basin of the central pool, the sky darkened without warning. A dust wall raced toward the city. She shouted for her team to take cover. The storm hit like an ancient curse, sand shrieking against metal, tearing tarps, uprooting saplings. When it ended, hours later, the terraces looked half buried. Only the oldest vine, the one born from the ancient brick, remained standing, its green defiantly alive amid the ruin. Layla touched its stem, tears carving paths through the dust on her face. Maybe this is what they meant by wonder, she whispered. Not perfection. Survival. In the weeks that followed, she refused every interview. She rebuilt quietly, brick by brick, refusing corporate aid. Locals joined again. Students, mothers, retired engineers, each bringing small acts of care. Together they dug channels, recycled grey water, shaded roots with salvaged cloth. It was slow work, but genuine. And as the terraces healed, something remarkable happened. Migrating birds began nesting there again. Then came bees. Then the first butterfly of the season. A blue one that landed on Lila's notebook as she recorded soil moisture. She smiled, remembering the myths that when the gardens still breathed, their blossoms were said to draw creatures from 100 miles away. Months later, the government held an emergency summit on climate resilience. Delegates from across the world gathered in Babylon, using the rebirth as a case study. Lila was asked to present. She spoke simply. What cannot keep building wonders if we refuse to live like gardeners? Her words spread across social media, stirring debate and admiration alike. Suddenly, universities wanted to teach her methods. NGOs wanted her guidance. Her inbox overflowed with invitations. But what truly moved her were the letters from children. Hundreds of them, scrawled in shaky handwriting, arrived from every continent. Pictures of rooftops filled with plants, windows turned into mini gardens, school projects named Our Hanging Gardens. One note read, Dear Dr. Lila, my mother waters the balcony every morning now. She says she feels like a queen. That line made her cry. Still, peace rarely lasts in history. A new administration took power, one more interested in prestige than preservation. They saw the rebirth as political gold, a chance to claim cultural dominance. Plans emerged for a massive expansion: hotels, performance stages, a luxury garden city surrounding the original terraces. Layla protested. "This place isn't a monument to own," she told them. "It's a living thing." But the minister smiled politely. "Everything living must serve progress, doctor." Soon, bulldozers arrived again. The same ground that had healed under her hands was carved into parcels. Lila watched helplessly as workers paved over the volunteer garden to make way for VIP parking. When she tried to stop them, security escorted her beyond the gate. She stood outside the fence, gripping the chain links, dust swirling around her boots. Beyond the noise of engines, she heard a faint sound, the rustle of leaves struggling against the wind. "Hold on," she whispered. "I'll find a way." That night she called journalists, scientists, activists, anyone who still cared. Within days, a global campaign ignited. Save the rebirth. Artists painted murals of the terraces, musicians wrote songs, millions signed petitions. The government doubled down, claiming the expansion was for heritage tourism. Tension mounted. Then, as if the heavens themselves joined the debate, the drought broke. A rare monsoon swept across the region. Rains hammered for 3 straight days, flooding roads, toppling scaffolds. When the storm cleared, something extraordinary appeared. The original terraces, long obscured by new construction, gleamed again under the open sky, cleansed, unburdened. The expansion project was ruined. The vines, however, thrived. Images of that rebirth within the rebirth went viral. Commentators called it nature's veto. Lila, standing barefoot in the mud, laughed until she wept. "The gardens choose for themselves," she said to the cameras. In the months that followed, Babylon changed once more. Tourists returned, but this time with a different reverence. They came not to photograph perfection, but to experience the humility of care. Workshops taught irrigation from recycled runoff. Seed exchange programs spread native flora. Every citizen became, in some small way, a gardener. Lila began traveling, carrying small vials of soil from the terrace to distant schools and community farms. She spoke quietly, never lecturing, simply telling the story of how patience had outlived politics. Wherever she went, new gardens sprouted. In rooftops of Athens, in refugee camps near Mosul, in deserts where children planted hope with their bare hands. By the 2nd anniversary of the rebirth, satellites captured something remarkable, a faint ring of green spreading outward from Babylon, kilometers wide. It wasn't a planned project, just thousands of individual patches of life, converging like ripples around a stone. Scientists dubbed it the Babylon effect. Layla preferred another terms, the memory of water. That winter, she returned home for the first time in months. The terraces shimmered with dew, stronger than ever. At the center stood the old vine, thick as a tree now, its branches woven through ancient bricks and modern steel alike. Birdsong filled the air. She sat beside it until nightfall, tracing the lines of the carved foundation stone with her fingers. So many hands had touched this same stone. royal, enslaved, forgotten, reborn. She realized then that the hanging gardens had never been a single wonder of the world. They were a cycle: growth, decay, renewal. A story that humanity keeps telling every time it remembers to care. Layla looked up. Above her, the stars glimmered through the mist rising from the watered terraces. They seemed to pulse in rhythm, with the vines slow breathing, as if sky and earth were once again conversing after centuries of silence. The world kept whispering the word Babylon, not as ruin, not as warning, but as rhythm. Across continents, the echo took root. In Mumbai, a school turned its rooftop into terraces of basil and jasmine, each pot labeled with a child's name. In Nairobi, women's cooperatives built hanging gardens from recycled bottles, their laughter spilling over the alleyways. In the Arctic, scientists grew moss under glass, domes, and called them mini Babylons, green defiance against the snow. Everywhere she traveled, Lila saw pieces of the ancient dream stitched into new soil, and she realized that the myth had never belonged to a single place. It had always been humanity's collective heartbeat, pulsing toward life. Years passed. Her hair silvered, her hands carried the faint scars of tools and sun. When she returned once more to Babylon, the terrace had changed again. No longer a spectacle, it breathed quietly, integrated into the city's rhythm. Children playing along its steps, scholars sketching under vines, stray cats sleeping in patches of shade. The old vine towered like a guardian, roots anchoring both centuries and sky. At sunset, she walked the narrow path up to the highest ledge. A group of students followed, carrying notebooks. They asked her what the secret was, how she had revived one of the lost wonders. She smiled, kneeling to scoop a handful of damp soil. "There is no secret," she said softly. "This earth remembers how to heal. We only had to listen long enough to hear it whisper." One of the students, a young girl with wide eyes, asked, "Do you think the original gardens really existed?" Lila looked over the horizon, where river and city merged into mist. "I think," she said, "they still do. Every time someone chooses to plant instead of burn, to mend instead of take, Babylon rises again." The girl wrote that down as if it was scripture. That night Lila stayed alone on the terrace. The city's hum faded into a lullaby of water trickling through the channels. She sat beside the vine, tracing the small clay seal Yusuf had given her years ago. The stars above glittered like scattered seeds. In the distance, thunder rolled, gentle, promising rain. And with the first drops, she felt the same calm she had imagined in the eyes of the old gardener. The same breath that had moved through Amytis's gardens millennia before. She closed her eyes, whispering to the darkness, "Keep growing, even when no one watches." Dawn arrived slowly. The terraces glistened with dew. Birds stirred among the leaves. Layla stood at the edge, feeling the wind rise from the river plain. She sensed she was no longer needed, that the garden had learned to care for itself. She left her hat hanging on a branch and walked down through the sleeping city. By the time the first tourists arrived, she was gone. Weeks later, the caretakers found her journal in the museum office. It contained no instructions, only reflections. Short entries written in looping handwriting. The world doesn't need more wonders. It needs caretakers. When we protect beauty, we protect memory. Maybe the real hanging gardens were never built of stone, but of moments like this, when strangers water the same soil. They framed the pages behind glass. Visitors often paused before them longer than before the terraces themselves. Decades drifted by. The city expanded, rivers shifted, new towers rose. Yet through it all, the rebirth endured. A green heart pulsing quietly at Babylon's center. During festivals, locals still climbed the terraces to pour a little water into the ancient basin. They called it Lila's offering. Children grew up hearing the story of the woman who had listened to the earth and found history breathing beneath her feet. Some believed she was buried under the vine. Others said she became part of the wind that cooled the leaves at night. Either way, the garden never stopped blooming. Far away, in another century, a child might open a history book or stream an old documentary and hear a gentle voice narrate. Once, there was a place so beautiful people thought it could not be real. A king built it for love. A queen dreamed beneath its shade, and then it vanished into time. But centuries later, when the world had almost forgotten how to wonder, someone listened, and the hanging gardens rose again. And that child might look out the window at a small plant on the sill and feel something stir, a quiet urge to water it, to keep it alive. The chain continues. Sometimes, during the hottest nights, locals claim they see strange lights above the terraces, soft glows moving through the mist like lanterns. Scientists explain them as fireflies. Poets call them spirits of the gardeners. Whatever they are, they drift upward, fading into the stars, as if reporting back that the world is still capable of tending, still capable of hope. In the final years of her life, Lila had written one last note, found folded inside the clay seal. Wonder is not a place, it is a promise. Keep the promise, and the gardens will never fade. And so Babylon sleeps once more, not in ruin, but in rest. Its terraces breathe beneath the dust, roots winding through both memory and myth. The vine still climbs, green against the sky, whispering through the centuries, because wonder never dies. It only sleeps